So, sorry. So welcome to our third talk of the interdisciplinary online speaker series on the ethics of argumentation. I'm really excited for this talk, which will be given by Dr. John Duffy, who I'm going to introduce in a second. Before that, I should just tell you that you probably just saw the pop-up. So this part of just the talk part of the talk, not the question period, is going to be video recorded, and we're going to upload that video on YouTube for others to see. We got quite a few messages of people who were asking whether the talk would be recorded because they couldn't come today. So please check that your microphone is turned off right now and is turned off during the talk, and then turn it off only if you want to ask a question. We have quite a few people here, so I think it's kind of best if we regulate the discussion after like this. If you come up with a question, even during the talk, just either type your name or a little Q into the chat. That way we'll kind of naturally develop an order in which we can ask questions. And now I'm really happy to welcome our speaker, Dr. John Duffy. Dr. Duffy from the University of Notre Dame has published widely on the ethics of writing, the rhetoric of disability, and the historical development of literacy in cross-cultural contexts. He is a recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and the Reverend Edmund P. Joyce CSC Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. And today he will be speaking to us about teaching argument as a virtuous practice. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Duffy. I think you are still muted.
Okay, sorry about that. You would think after so many Zoom meetings, that little detail would be sorted out. I apologize. Before I say anything else, I want to thank Professor Katarina Stevens for the kind introduction, and Professor Andrew Aberdeen for extending the invitation to join you in this conference. It's a privilege to be here. I'm appreciative of your presence today. I think we've all had a lot of Zoom conferences, and to attend another voluntarily speaks to a great level of commitment. So thank you. And I know as well that your schedules are demanding, so I appreciate your presence. I come to this particular conference with what I believe to be an appropriate degree of humility. This is a conference on ethical argumentation, and I am neither a moral philosopher nor, strictly speaking, an argumentation scholar. My training is in the field of rhetoric and composition, sometimes called rhetoric and writing, sometimes called writing studies, which takes as its central concern the teaching of writing, mostly at the post-secondary level. I'm going to share with you a version of a talk that I have given around the United States and abroad on the subject of teaching writing and what I consider the ethical dimensions of that work. Mostly what I'll be talking about today is pedagogy. So in the talk, I will make an assertion and I'll pose a question. The assertion is that while argument is frequently represented and more frequently taught as an act of intellectual combat and a struggle for domination among contending parties, we may also understand argument, both the activity and the teaching of the activity, as a practice of radical humility, one that necessarily and inescapably engages students and teachers in deliberations about such virtues as truthfulness, accountability, open-mindedness, and intellectual courage. To teach argument, in other words, is to teach practices of ethical discourse, or what I have called rhetorical virtues. The question I will address is what it might mean if this conception of argument were embraced in college courses across the country, in first-year writing courses certainly, but also in disciplinary courses, such as those many of you may teach. What would it matter? What would it mean in a moment of intense political polarization if we were to teach argument in this way? And I will suggest in answering that question that it might be very meaningful indeed, that how we teach argument might have implications for the future of public discourse and democratic practice in the United States. Now, that sounds more than a bit grandiloquent, and I will return to that statement at the close of this talk. But I would like to begin with a few definitions that I hope will clarify how I'm using some of the key terms of this talk. When I speak of rhetoric, I mean, after Aristotle, the ability to see in each case all the available means of persuasion. In this conception, argument is a constituent of rhetoric, one of the available means. By ethics, I mean the willingness of moral agents to act in the right way for the right reasons at the right moment. I mean the ability and willingness to act as a good person would act in a given situation. This is no doubt familiar to all of you as a definition derived from virtue ethics, and in particular the Aristotelian version presented in the Nicomachean Ethics, which represents an alternative to the ethics of obligations and consequences. Next, when I speak of writing in this talk, I am referring primarily to the kind of writing most commonly taught in college courses, in college programs, such as the one that I direct at the University of Notre Dame, which for the most part is the teaching of academic argument. I focus in this talk on the teaching of argument because of its currency in these programs, and not because it's the only genre taught at the college level. It's not, nor because it's the most important written means of persuasion. In all likelihood, it may not be. Research in cognitive psychology has begun to cast serious doubts on the capacity of arguments to modify human behavior. And scholars such as Todd DeStigter have argued that the teaching of academic argument is grounded in unwarranted assumptions about the relationship of argument to critical thinking, democratic practice, and economic mobility. Still, I focus on argument both because it remains the coin of the realm in academic life, a necessary element of students' progress through university, and because of its ubiquity in public discourse, particularly in the realms of politics and popular culture. In this talk, as a matter of style and to avoid redundancy, I will in times speak of the ethics of writing or the ethics of teaching writing, but I am referring in all those instances to argument and the teaching of argument. Finally, let me clarify what I mean by the term argument, beginning with two negative definitions. In the first, the popular understanding of argument as an angry quarrel, a shouting match, and so forth, is not the argument, the conception I'm using today. A second view, more precise, which for lack of a better term, I'll call the scholarly conception, is to quote Douglas Walton, the giving of reasons to support or criticize a claim that is questionable or open to doubt. This view of argument describes a rational process in which we make a series of propositions or statements backed by reasons. I offer the proposition, for example, that you should support immigration reform, and I provide you with reasons. My purpose is to persuade you to think as I think, to perhaps to feel as I feel, or maybe to motivate you to take some action, such as giving money to an organization I support. Implicit in this view of argument is the exercise of power and the will to control others. David Zarefsky, for example, has cautioned that argument can involve, quote, applying superior to inferior force in an attempt to limit freedom of choice. In this understanding, argument can serve as a means for dominating another, bending another person to your will. Such attitudes are particularly prevalent, contends the linguist Deborah Tannen, in an academic culture that prizes intellectual combat and the ability to position our work in opposition to someone else's, which we then prove wrong. This conception of argument recalls distantly the ancient text, Gorgias's Encomium of Helen, in which rhetoric was represented as a powerful incantatory force, a persuader of souls that caused Helen to leave her husband and led to the annihilation of the city of Troy. I'd like to offer today a third conception, or at least a different emphasis in argument, one in which it is understood neither as a quarrel nor as the giving of reasons for the purpose of controlling others. Rather, I would like to suggest that we see argument as a relationship, a discursive connection of two or more people. In proposing argument as a relationship, such as I am doing at this moment, We invite others, our listeners or readers, to pause for a moment, to sit beside us, figuratively speaking, and to hear us out. We invite others to make connections with us for the purpose of examining a reason, a proposition, a way of understanding. From this perspective, argument may be understood neither as a fight nor an act of domination, but rather as an expression of acute, even radical humility. Why humility? Because whenever we make an argument, we subject ourselves to the evaluation of others. We put a proposition before our readers and listeners and invite them, as I am inviting you today, to make a judgment about our ideas, our values, our character. Our readers and listeners may come to agree with us. They may doubt us. They may even reject or revile us. But that is what we signed up for when we initiated the relationship of the argument. We are not in this relationship subservient. We don't accept any evaluation. We resist some judgments. But in the very act of making an argument, we invite a judgment to be made, and we commit ourselves to receiving that judgment. Why call this expression of humility radical? Because to think of argument in this way is to make such an extreme and thoroughgoing break with the strident tribal discourse that characterizes contemporary public argument, that it constitutes a radical departure from our present practices. Now, I just said that to make an argument is to be judged. But to argue is not simply to receive judgments, it is also to make them. And it is in the making of judgments that we are more deeply enmeshed in ethical deliberation and decision-making. We can perhaps see this most clearly by considering the structure of arguments, the different and interlocking parts of which arguments are made. For the sake of this talk, let us say that an argument consists of at least three related parts: the claim, the evidence or proof, and what writing teachers such as myself typically call the counter-argument, the moment where we examine the views that differ from our own. Now, there are, of course, many different languages for describing the structure and schemes of argument. And in writing programs across the country, we would find arguments taught using Toulmin's version of argument with claims, warrant, backing, and so forth. We would find arguments taught by means of stasis theory, Roman stasis theory. Other programs embrace Perlman and Titika's conceptions of argument. But for this talk, for the sake of clarity, and so that we are all on the same page when I'm using this term, let us proceed with claims, proofs, and counter-arguments. I do this as illustrative, but also because I think the ethical commitments will be similar regardless of the terminology we favor. Excuse me a moment. I can never drink water in front of an audience at a conference. It's interesting. I can do it on Zoom, much easier. Okay, so let's begin with the claim. The claim is the statement that asserts a belief or a position. The word claim comes from the Latin clamare, which means to call or cry out. When we make a claim, then, we are calling out for a connection with another. We are crying out, in the Latin sense of the term, for dialogue in a measure of shared understanding with our readers or listeners. We are initiating the relationship of the argument. For that relationship to succeed, or to use Aristotle's term, to flourish, both reader and writer must be able to make certain assumptions about one another. Each must be confident that the other possesses certain qualities, traits, or dispositions, what Aristotle and contemporary moral philosophers would call virtues, and what I call rhetorical virtues when these are enacted in discourse. The first quality that the reader and writer must assume of one another if the claim is to proceed is intellectual honesty. You must be confident that my claims are not made for the purpose of deceiving or manipulating you, and I must be reasonably confident that you will not willfully distort my ideas. We may be skeptical of one another's claims, we may disagree vehemently, we may never find common ground. Yet if each of us enters the argument trusting, or at least not dismissing, the basic honesty of the other, there is a possibility of dialogue between us. So when we teach students to write claims or to make claims in the context of an argument, when we teach them to make claims that are arguable, substantive, properly qualified, and all the rest, we are teaching them, I put to you, most fundamentally and most essentially, practices of truthfulness. Cicely Bach defines truthfulness as the disposition to tell the truth, and the truthful person as, quote, someone who aims consistently to speak so as not to mislead others. This is truthfulness with a small t, rather than the epistemological big T of whether truth exists and so forth. We are talking about the activity of speaking or writing in ways deliberately, consistently not to mislead others. Truthfulness in this sense is the virtue of opposites and avoidances. It is the opposite of mendacity, duplicity, and distortion, and it is the avoidance of lies, theft, and cheating. Truthfulness is what we first of all and most obviously owe to others, Alistair McIntyre has written, if we wish to form and sustain relationships with them. When we teach claims in this view, we are teaching students more than just rhetorical strategies. We are teaching an ethical practice, the rhetorical virtue of truthfulness. But the claim in an argument is but one part of a pairing. It's the first line of a couplet. Claims call for evidence. If I make the claim to you that admitting refugees to the United States is good for the economy, you properly expect me to provide the evidence in support of that claim. The evidence may come from an academic journal, from news reports, from historical archives, or from personal experience. Whatever the source, we are obliged in the argument to supply the evidence, the proofs. Those of us who teach college writing have thought carefully about evidence. We have studied what counts as evidence, how it functions, how to evaluate it. In recent years, we have begun to look more carefully at what Mike Caulfield calls the environment of argument and the environment of evidence, how to sort or pick apart conspiracy theories and so forth. We can explain to our students how to find evidence, how to present it, how to organize it. We've even addressed in a narrow sense the ethics of evidence, typically framing such conversation in terms of using sources and avoiding plagiarism and so forth. These are basic norms in the writing classroom. But to supply evidence for one's claims may also be understood as a decidedly virtuous activity. When we provide evidence in support of claims, we are making a statement of our accountability, our willingness to take responsibility for the claims we make and the words we use in making them. Margaret Urban Walker has written that accountability means, quote, a presumption that someone can be called to answer, to stand before others for an examination of and judgment upon his or her behavior. When we supply evidence appropriate to our claims, or when we teach students to supply it, we are being called to answer, to stand before others, to provide the proofs by which our claims may be tested and judged. And when we teach these practices to students, when we insist that claims must be paired with proofs and that those proofs meet the standards of accuracy, relevancy, sufficiently, and the rest on which we typically insist, we are teaching more than norms of academic argument. We are teaching practices of ethical argumentation. But ethical arguments do not end with the provision of evidence. Academic arguments call for practitioners to commit themselves to the consideration of other views, especially those views that contradict their own. In the language of the college essay, this is the rhetorical move teachers of writing commonly call the counter-argument, or the place in the argument where we consider the legitimacy of those ideas that disagree with ours. Now, there is certainly a pragmatic dimension to counter-arguments. The counter-argument can create the appearance of thoughtful consideration, even as it serves to discredit opposing views. My concession to your arguments about religious freedom, while suggesting I am measured and unbiased, can function as a tactic for undermining your position. My willingness to accommodate your ideas about transgender individuals, which may appear to grant legitimacy to your ideas, may be a pretext for furthering my own. Just as ethos is the appearance, though not necessarily the presence, of practical wisdom, moral virtue, and goodwill, so too can the counter-argument create perceptions of accommodation and fair-mindedness where none exist. Yet if counter-arguments can be pragmatic and strategic, they are equally opportunities to rehearse practices of ethical discourse. Counter-arguments call upon writers and speakers to be open to other perspectives, to acknowledge these fairly and respectfully, to avoid biased or straw man summaries that oversimplify or distort opposing arguments. But even beyond these, counter-arguments call upon writers and speakers to chance that most radical and most unsettling possibility of all, the possibility that we might come to change our minds. When we engage the views of others, if we do so seriously and thoughtfully, we may be disturbed by what we find. We may find our perspective is uninformed, that our views are narrow, or worst of all, that we're wrong. To say it another way, the counter-argument calls upon us to practice as best we can the rhetorical virtues of open-mindedness, intellectual generosity, and intellectual courage. To be open-minded means we do not consider alternative views narrowly or resentfully, but rather strive to be one of those people, like the character of Socrates in Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias, who claims to be, quote, quite as ready to be refuted as to refute. Now, whether Socrates was actually open-minded in this way is a different conversation, but that is the ideal. Daniel Cohen has written that open-mindedness consists of the ability to listen carefully, the willingness to take what others say seriously, and if called for, the resolve to adopt others' positions as one's own. In the end, we may not agree with those competing views. In most cases, we probably won't, but neither as open-minded readers and writers will we dismiss them because they trouble our convictions. In its best sense, the counter-argument calls upon us to read in a spirit of confidence and goodwill, regarding those who think differently than we do, not as enemies to be mistrusted or destroyed, but as potential colleagues and partners who can deepen our knowledge of an issue and, not incidentally, strengthen our arguments. When we write counter-arguments then, or when we teach them to our students, we are practicing the rhetorical virtue of intellectual generosity, welcoming the opportunity to engage with others whose ideas, proposals, and values may be antithetical to our own, and yet may nonetheless enrich us. Generosity is not just the giving of things, time, and service, the geographer Yi-Fu Tuan has written. It is also how we think of another person, the merit of his or her work. Now, none of that, it goes without saying, is easy. To be open-minded and intellectually generous calls for a certain kind of resolve, a certain tenacity. When we engage with those ideas that most challenge our own, we open ourselves to the possibility that our ideas, our assumptions, our core values may not stand up to the challenge. And this in turn may threaten to destabilize some part of that ever-evolving medley of beliefs, values, quandaries, boundaries, and self-concepts that we understand to be our identities. To write a counter-argument calls for serious courage. By courage, I do not mean physical bravery or the kind of courage we associate with soldiers in battle or firefighters rushing into burning buildings. Rather, I'm talking about intellectual courage, or the courage to expose oneself to the ideas of others when these may threaten our worldview or even our material resources. I would like to illustrate, if I may, with a story. Some years ago, I taught a first-year writing course at the University of Wisconsin. I had a student at this time, I'll call her Christine, from northern Wisconsin. This was in the 1990s, during that period that became known in Wisconsin as the Wisconsin Walleye Wars. In this clash of cultures, white sports fishermen and resort owners in the region of Upper Wisconsin, a beautiful tourist area if you've ever had the pleasure, were at odds with members of the Native American Ojibwe tribe. The Ojibways claimed the legal right based on treaty agreements with the United States government dating back to the 19th century to hunt and fish off reservation and to spearfish walleye during the spawning season. The sports fishermen and resort owners, for their part, maintained that Ojibwe hunting practices were depleting the walleye stock and were destroying the local economy. They objected to members of the tribe receiving what they regarded as special rights to use spearfishing methods that were illegal for other fishermen and during the spawning season. The conflict was intense and sometimes violent. During the spawning season, hundreds of white protesters would gather at the lakes where the Ojibwe fished, shouting racial slurs, throwing rocks at the fishermen, and launching speedboats that circled the Ojibwe boats, attempting to swamp them. Riot police were eventually called in to maintain order. Christine, my student, was the daughter of a resort owner. She felt that her father and other resort owners were being hurt economically, and she resented intensely media accounts that represented, in her views, the resort owners and as racists. Christine decided she would write about the controversy to fulfill my final class assignment, which called for students to research and write about a question from multiple perspectives. Now, I should make clear that Christine was a quiet student and I was an inexperienced teacher. She seldom contributed to class discussions and I rarely saw her outside of class. Moreover, the drafts of her paper that she submitted were sketchy, a page or two, and I was mostly in the dark about her progress. One afternoon, she surprised me by showing up at my office unexpectedly. She wanted to change her thesis. Was that all right, she said. I said it was fine, and what was the new thesis? Christine said she wanted to continue to argue that the resort owners had legitimate grievances, as tribal fishing practices did indeed threaten their livelihoods. But she said she'd been reading and she'd been thinking about what she read, and she now wanted to modify her argument by writing that the Ojibwe too had legitimate claims and that their traditional practices should be respected. Her new thesis would call for an accommodation of some kind. I don't remember the paper that Christine eventually wrote. I don't remember the grade I gave it, but I do remember the admiration I felt for what I now think of as her intellectual courage, her willingness to look at contrary points of view, to take them seriously, and in the end to expand her ways of thinking about a problem that affected her and her family in a material way. If I were to describe it to today, I would say that her paper expressed the practice of rhetorical virtue, the virtue of courage. So, to review, I've proposed that to teach argument is to teach practices of ethical communication, or what I call rhetorical virtues. To be clear, I'm not saying that we should teach ethical discourse or that the world would be a better place if we did and so forth. Nor am I saying that the very fact of making an argument results in ethical discourse, that the fashioning of claims, proofs, and counter arguments will reliably result in virtuous discourse. Far from it. Rather, I'm suggesting that teaching argument inevitably and inescapably engages students and teachers in acts of ethical deliberation and decision-making. And this is the case whether or not we see this as our charge and whether or not we consciously adopt a vocabulary of rhetorical ethics. Will the claims we make or teach our students to make be truthful and transparent, or will the truth be shaded in an effort to win the argument? Will the evidence we present or teach our students to present be reliable, factual, and even-handed? Or will we choose evidence simply on the basis of whether we agree with it? Will we look seriously and clearly and teach our students to do so at the arguments antithetical to our own? Or will we dismiss these as troubling and potentially disturbing? Implicit in the answers to these questions are the practices of rhetorical virtue. My question, what if these implicit practices were made explicit? What if the language of teaching argument extended beyond the giving of reasons, beyond claims and proofs, to include the language of open-mindedness, accountability, tolerance, and generosity? What if teachers of writing, what if faculty in all disciplines were explicit in teaching argument as a form of ethical practice? What difference might that make? What difference might it make to students? What difference might it make to our university discourses? And what difference might it make to the public discourse and the practice of democracy? I am not telling you anything when I tell you that those of us in the United States, and indeed in certain European countries, are facing what is in many ways an unprecedented assault on the core values of academic and democratic life, which I would describe as a commitment to truth, a respect for evidence, and a tolerance for views that differ from our own. Today, we are awash in a melange of post-truths, alternative facts, and a more or less daily stream of falsehoods issued by political leaders, unscrupulous pundits, and a motley assortment of internet trolls and bots. We inhabit a rhetorical climate in which there is no widely shared agreement as to the nature of a fact, or what counts as evidence, or how to interpret what evidence may be presented. More, in our deeply polarized political moment, there is little place in civic arguments for the kind of deliberative language that might explore ambiguities, express doubts, or admit errors. The result is arguments, or something that look like arguments, reduced to assertions and counter-assertions, with many expressed in language that is irrational, shrill, and increasingly violent. And all of it is disseminated, thanks to our extraordinary technological capacities, faster, further, and to more people than at any time previously in human history. Given all that, what if we were to teach argument as ethical discourse in our courses? What difference would that make? Well, it's not difficult to answer that question in the negative. Not much difference at all, maybe none. And it may seem an act of willful, if not absurd, self-aggrandizement to imagine that courses in first-year writing or third-year philosophy or fourth-year economics hold some key, however contingent, to transforming our toxic public arguments and our seemingly rapid descent into lurid conspiracy theories. So it may not make any difference at all. But let me conclude this talk with a brief thought experiment. Let us imagine a professor, in this case, a professor of writing, who teaches argument. Let us call her Professor Z. Professor Z works at a small private college in a small Midwestern state. Each semester, Professor Z teaches 3 sections of first-year writing in classes capped at 20 students per section. Let us suppose further that the writing program in which she teaches offers 35 sections in the fall and spring semesters, none in summer. That means each year, assuming Professor Z works in a writing program with a strong institutional culture committed to the teaching of rhetorical ethics, that some 1,400 students, let's say 1,300, adjusting for attrition, will graduate from Professor Z's college, having had one course at least in which students received explicit instruction in virtuous practices of writing, speech, and argument. Looking ahead, we can estimate, assuming course and cap numbers remain relatively stable, that in 5 years, some 6,500 students will have graduated, having taken a writing class that introduces relationships of rhetoric, writing, and ethics. In 10 years, that number is about 13,000 students. In 15 years, the number is just under 20,000 students, many of whom by then will be launched in their careers and established in their communities, where they will have opportunities and perhaps responsibilities to speak and write to political, economic, educational, and other questions affecting their lives and the welfare of their communities. Let's think a little further. Professor Z works at a small private college, we've said. However, Big State University, some 200 miles to the south, has a much larger writing program, offering 100 sections of first-year writing, capped at 20 students per section per semester. If the writing program at Big State is similarly committed to teaching practices of ethical discourses, then the numbers we are envisioning grow substantially. Every year, we may estimate that some 3,500 students will graduate from Big State, having taken at least one class in which they received instruction, explicit instruction in practices of rhetorical ethics. In 5 years, that number is 17,500. In 10 years, 35,000. In 15 years, more than 52,000 students would have left that university, having had opportunities to examine the place of truthfulness, accountability, open-mindedness, and intellectual courage in their communications. Now we can add, for the sake of this experiment, all the numbers of all the students who will graduate from the state's branch campuses, each of which has its own writing program, the graduates of the state's community colleges, technical schools, and religious colleges. Now we may add all the other private liberal arts institutions in the state. What if the graduates of each of these institutions had taken at least one writing course in which rhetorical ethics was an explicit topic of discussion? And what if that commitment were made in those same institutions by professors of sociology, of history, of marketing, and psychology? What if the teaching of argument in those disciplines was taught as the practice of ethical discourse? We can go further still. We said Professor Z is employed at a small college in a small Midwestern state. But let us imagine the same commitments to ethical rhetoric have been made in writing programs and institutions in other states. What if we add to the numbers all the students who will graduate having studied ethical rhetoric in colleges, universities, community colleges in Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, and Michigan, in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas, in Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia? What if we look west and add to our numbers all the students who will graduate from post-secondary institutions in Arizona, California, Oregon, and Washington? The National Center of Education Statistics reported that in 2014, some 21 million students were enrolled in post-secondary granting institutions in the United States. If we divide that number crudely by 4, representing each year towards degree, that means the first-year class is comprised of approximately 5 million students. The real number is probably higher since many students will drop out. How many of those students will take a course in elementary or introductory argument? The numbers are hard to come by, but if we are ultra conservative and say just a quarter of those 5 million enroll in one of our courses, that would be more than 1 million students enrolled in such courses each year. 5 million in 5 years, and so forth. I said earlier that ethics and ethical reflections are implicit in the practices we teach. It's not that we should teach rhetorical ethics, that we ought to be good citizens. Rather, it is that we are always and already teaching ethical discourse, even if we do not use that language. But what if we did? What if we made what is implicit in our classrooms explicit? What if we made the decision to discuss with our students openly, directly, critically, the moral dimensions of their language choices? What might be possible? We cannot say for certain. Teachers since Plato have dreamed of a rhetoric that would connect reading and writing practices to the moral life. And yet this is a case the humanities has never quite been able to make. Or so the critic Richard Lanham contends in his essay, The Q Question, in which he examines Quintilian's famous connection between the good speaker and the good person. Having reviewed the evidence for and against Quintilian's formulation, Lanham is finally skeptical arguing that the transformative powers of moral rhetoric, of which argument is a critical element, are more often assumed than proven, more often an expression of faith than demonstrable fact. And so we may not be able to say definitively just what it would mean if teachers of argument across the nation from Connecticut to California engaged the ethical with their students. But perhaps the Q question is not the right question. Maybe we should instead be asking the P question. What might be possible? What possibilities might follow if 1 million or 5 million or 10 million students graduated from our institutions, having been taught that argument cannot be extricated from ethics, and that our arguments require not merely that we persuade or exhort, but call upon us to communicate in ways to speak to the kinds of people we wish to be and the sorts of communities in which we wish to live. What would that mean for our students, for our society? We cannot say for certain. Causality is a complex, elusive, and often frustrating phenomenon. Yet in a moment of post-truth, alternative facts, rampant conspiracy theories, such questions I have tried to suggest to you today are worth asking, and their answers are worth seeking. Thank you very much for your attention.
Let's thank our speaker for this wonderful talk. And I will, do you want to put any questions in the chat, or would you